I'm really excited to finally kick off Inside Infrastructure for 2021. We have a new season, a new logo and a new co-host this year. Janice, I'm so glad to be sharing the microphone with you. We've known each other for a number of years, but maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Adrian. So thank you. I'm excited to join you on this podcast. A little bit about myself. So I've just recently joined PwC's Integrated Infrastructure team. I'm a partner in infrastructure strategy and analytics. My background's really in government, economic policy and infrastructure strategy. I am known variously for holding certain roles. I worked, in New South Wales government in what was the Department of Premier and Cabinet. I worked on the Hill with the Infrastructure Minister and Treasurer, and since then I've worked in consulting. So I've held various roles at EY and also led the government practice at LEK Consulting. But it's been, really a career spent working in and out of really important public policy and economic policy issues.
So you're a bona fide infrastructure nerd.
Yes, and I think with this podcast, I am now officially inaugurated into serious infrastructure nerdery.
It's great news because it is a requirement for being a co-host.
Thank you.
Even though we've been upgrading a lot this year and we're still going to have the same great content and the same nerdery, as I said, around infrastructure and, of course, a deep dive into the background of some leading industry figures. Janice, who have we got?
So we certainly have some exciting guests coming up. Graeme Newton is our first. We had a great chat, covered various things, and without further ado, let's dive into the episode.
So welcome to Season 2 of Inside Infrastructure, and Graeme Newton, the CEO of the Cross River Rail Delivery Authority, has kindly agreed to be our first guest. Welcome to Inside Infrastructure, Graeme.
Great to be here, Adrian. Thanks.
We're, of course, up in Brisbane and around the country. You're a CEO in the infrastructure space. Lots of people will know you. I think it's something like 15, 16 years as a CEO across various different parts of the infrastructure sector. But those casual listeners maybe don't know who you are and don't know that background. Maybe you could just take us through a bit of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Look, it's been an interesting little journey. I guess I was heavily involved at the front end with the Coordinator General's Department, and in Queensland that sort of is often embedded into the infrastructure department. But then off that experience fairly early in my career, I got involved in the project delivery side on government client side, and that led me down the path of being involved in some major water infrastructure project delivery. I was involved in some energy-related stuff, and then some more water-related projects, and then the disaster reconstruction after the 2011 floods. But along that way, I actually got appointed as Coordinator General and was running the infrastructure department for a short period. But then when the floods came along, I was asked to set up the Reconstruction Authority. Had a 3-year period with Deloitte, leading the public sector arm for the Queensland government, and then was asked to be involved in Cross River Rail, and that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years.
So what do you self-identify as? You're a project guy, or?
Well, probably very much a project, but on the owner side, and large public infrastructure seems to be the way. The Cross River Rail Delivery Authority is the fourth organisation like this, either an SPV or a statutory authority that I've been head of. And I kind of like that space between government and the private sector and delivering that project. So I like the space where I'm not in the middle of a department, really on the edge of government, but really doing most of my heavy interfaces with private sector. And often in this project type organisation, most of your employees are coming from a private sector background or have had a pretty strong infrastructure experience.
So as your first transport project, how have you found it changing sectors, or is it really quite the same as what you've done in some of the big water projects, around storage and dams and whatnot?
Yeah, look, it's similar and different. And that's a really good question, because early on people would say, there's three ways. There's the right way, the wrong way, and the roll way. The ability to move between infrastructure sectors I've quite enjoyed, because it's really challenging to move and understand the different problems that you're looking to solve. But at the end of the day, you're implementing government policy. They're large-scale projects. The procurement has a lot of similarities to it. But then when you get into the specialist details, that's when you really need those specialist advisors on your team who can help take the project and guide it through on its delivery.
Graeme, I don't know if this is by design, but there is scant information available on the internet about your career before the CEO gig. So are you an engineer? What did you study? How did you go from, you grew up in Brisbane, right?
Yeah, I moved to Brisbane when I was in year 7. So I actually lived on a farm in country Victoria prior to that, and then came to Brisbane, studied here, and then became a convert to the Maroon side of things.
Sorry, just to be clear, did you expunge that history because you don't want people to know you're Victorian?
No, I'm quite happy to admit that I'm a Richmond supporter, more so in recent years than the prior 37 years. But so no, definitely that. But I did a surveying degree originally, and then I did a master's in project management off the top of that as well, and then obviously the various company directors and so forth courses after that. So, but heavily been involved in the infrastructure and project delivery side of things. So I guess that's what I relate to is very much the project and program delivery.
Hey, entirely outside of the career, so being in Brisbane from kind of year 7 would be, what's that, about sort of 12 years old, 11, 12 years old? Yeah. Is that right? I imagine it's changed a fair bit in... Yeah. I don't want to age you, but there is a reasonable amount of elapsed time between 12-year-old Graeme and now.
Yeah, so that was, if you think about it in the context of the current project, I mean, we moved here in 1980, and the first electric trains in Brisbane were 1979. So it's really, that sort of was a transformation in Brisbane. I mean, the Merivale Bridge was built in 1979 as well, too. So that was the first rail crossing of the river as well. But what we've sort of seen is the connectedness. There's always been a north side, south side. The Brisbane River is quite a large river, and it's quite a barrier in the city, and there hasn't been a lot of connection between both sides of the river. But we're seeing that with pedestrian bridges, with South Bank. Obviously, Cross River Rail will contribute to that, but also the council are looking at putting in green bridges as well too. So I think there's this recognition that the city will benefit from this greater connectedness, and that's what I guess I've started to see in the last 10 years.
In seeing that the development of the rail network in Brisbane is somewhat symbolic of the development of the city, how does it feel then to be working on the Cross River Rail project? What does it mean for the further development or the next stage of development of Brisbane as a city?
Yeah, I think it's quite significant. In Brisbane, the Central Station and Roma Street Station aren't actually in the CBD. They're on the edge of the CBD, and because the Brisbane CBD is on a peninsula, on the bend of a river, and there really isn't a railway station in the middle of the city. I guess the comparison I'd give for people in Sydney would be, imagine Central Station in Sydney was the closest station to the CBD of Sydney. You still got a 10 to 15 minute walk from Central Station in Brisbane to get into the various parts of the city. So Cross River Rail putting a railway station right in the dead centre of the CBD will just basically change the way in which people will look to travel. People actually get off in South Brisbane and walk across the bridge because it's closer than staying on the train and getting off at Roma Street or Central Station to get to their destination. So I think it will change the way the city's shaped.
Yeah. And one of the things that is interesting about that project, and I wonder if you could elaborate on it for listeners who might not be as familiar with Brisbane, is that it serves a really important CBD function, but it serves a much wider purpose, doesn't it, really, around supporting growth outside of Brisbane, so in that wider metropolitan area.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because while the work's happening in the inner core of the CBD, most of the beneficiaries are actually on the fringe, because like a lot of cities, the urban growth is on the fringe. So Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Ipswich, and all of those infill suburbs in between is really where we're going to see about 80% of the population growth over the next period of time. COVID was sort of always the question mark. Was that going to create a hit for Southeast Queensland? It's actually quite the opposite. We're seeing greater numbers of people, and I think the last I saw was a report saying there's 900 people per week moving to Southeast Queensland now. So the forecasts around population growth, 3.5 million by 2040, I think it is for the Greater Southeast is really looking pretty likely.
Graeme, I'm going to come back to Cross River Rail later, but I wanted to cast a little bit further back in your career because I think it is instructive about some of the things you're doing now. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority, following the floods in 2011, you were the CEO. You stood up that authority. You did the bulk of its work at in the recovery of that disaster, but it's subsequently been used for other purposes. Maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about the genesis of the Reconstruction Authority, why it was needed as an authority, and then the sort of some of that experience of reconstruction in a post-disaster environment.
Yeah. Look, people may recall we had the floods in the early part of, or I suppose the latter part of 2010, early 2011. Brisbane flooded on the 10th of January, 2011. And then Cyclone Yasi came through on the 3rd of February 2011. So the state got hit pretty significantly, and the government decided that really they needed a dedicated entity to drive the reconstruction. The initial estimate at the front end was about $7.5 billion worth of damage. We had subsequent floods in 2012 and 2013, which bumped the estimate up to about $12 billion.
What was that damage to?
Primarily to infrastructure. So it's public infrastructure is what that cost is attributable to. The private infrastructure, such as housing and so forth, was another damage bill altogether, but that was largely covered by the insurance sector and businesses. The number I talk about there is damage to public infrastructure. So mostly it's roads. About 80% of it was roads, bridges, culverts, those sorts of things. Wherever water intersects with a road, you get damage. And then there were things like schools and public buildings, hospitals and things like that. Anything that got flood damage or cyclone damage needed to be repaired. So we were running the program. There were 79 local governments that were affected. The whole state was impacted. We had 19 government departments that were a part of it, and obviously transport and main roads, on the main roads network. And we had things like Cunningham Gap Road was basically slipping off the side of the hill, as was the Diagula Range. So those were sort of really expensive tasks that needed some pretty significant work. So the government setting up the Reconstruction Authority was really trying to bring it under one roof and make it focused with this single mind around getting the state back and rebuilt as quickly as possible. Now, the time frame was quite limited. The funding in the first instance for 2011 was 3 years, and then 2012 was 2 years. So we had to really get things going. And it was about doing a massive program, working with local governments and government agencies to get that program of works happening and then coordinate it. And I'd have to say it was one of the most rewarding jobs I did, because you really felt like you were part of getting the state back onto its feet and getting revitalised and re-energised, and getting that confidence back that businesses could go and grow their cattle crops or their banana crops, or have a confidence around a tourism enterprise or something like that, where they might have been wiped out because of a cyclone. So it was a pretty interesting time, but very challenging at the time, I can tell you.
How did you find the pressure of having to manage the rebuild task, and what did you think Australia learned out of that? Insofar as rebuilding, redesigning, relocating infrastructure?
Yeah, it was. There was a lot of pressure. I remember. I don't think I actually took a day off for the first 6 months, to be honest. It was. It was literally that long, and neither did the team. Everybody really got into it and got focused, because there was that greater good that we were looking to try and achieve. And if we didn't do it, it wasn't going to happen. So we had to come together. The thing that was really evident out of it, though, I saw all three levels of government just pull together. It's it's one of those moments where you see for this united focus, you can see government perform. We saw at the early stages of COVID as well too. I think we're starting to see some indications in relation to this Olympic bid as well, where when three levels of government get aligned and get focused, there's some amazing things can happen. So the Reconstruction Authority is still going, 10 years strong now. Queensland has got this sort of knowledge base. They've moved very much to data-led approach. One thing we started was damage tracking so that we could track where damage occurred and where repeat damage occurred, and then that leads to things like a new policy that I was involved in, which was around betterment, which was essentially building things back better than they were before, because the previous policy was one of just replacing like with like, because federal government didn't want states being gouging as far as funding goes. But in a lot of places where you had repeat damage, if you built it slightly better, you actually make saving in the long run. And I'm really pleased to see that policy has really stuck and carried through. And all credit to Brendan Moon, who's the CEO now, who's carried that forward and implemented it. And like I said, the data-driven approach just leaves it to no doubt that it's being successful.
You kind of hinted it in one of your answers there about pandemic response and the Olympics and a thing for different levels of government to coalesce around. If I can just unpick part of that, and I'm asking you to go outside of your tracks a bit here, but to what extent do you think the success of Australia's and Queensland's response from a health perspective to the pandemic is reflective of the idea that we do deal with natural disasters on a relatively regular basis, that we've got the systems and people in place, those kind of organisations where we respond to data, we respond to evidence and experts. Do you think there is a link between those two things?
I think there certainly is. I saw it particularly at the front end in Queensland. I mean, Jeanette Young, I worked very closely with her in the disaster space because she'd always look after. She was always, obviously chief health officer. And I remember when we had the cyclone Yasi coming up in North Queensland, she was heavily involved in the evacuation of the Cairns Hospital. So there's this sort of notion of needing to make decisions that need to be made in a timely way, and not being afraid to just get on with it and then make a decision and then make it the right decision. I think that's it. The difference, I suppose, with this pandemic is it's actually gone on longer than any natural disaster. I mean, often a natural disaster will take a couple of weeks to come through. In our case in Queensland, which was unusual in 2011, is it actually went on for about 4 or 5 months, which was quite a long period, and you started to see fatigue creep in. But I do, back to your question, I do think the exposure to natural disasters, the exposure to vast distances, and the need to communicate to people and not just tap people on the head and say, look, don't worry, she'll be right, just follow what I tell you to do. There's an acknowledgement there that people need to be informed and need to be taken with you and given context, and then the community will swing in behind if they understand and they're not treated like fools.
And what about the recovery piece? Because in the circumstance of the disaster recovery and rebuild, it's about replacing infrastructure that's damaged or lost. But what we've seen during the pandemic, the Queensland government's infrastructure spend, there was a 10% increase in response to the pandemic, a view of bringing forward projects. Do you think any of those learnings from that kind of fast response rebuild can be applied to stimulating the economy quickly and efficiently?
Yeah, I think it does come back to, and what I was talking about before, things like the physical reconnection of transport or economic corridors was always our priority. Getting power, water, sewer, roads, rail back up going, because the quickest way for people to respond to a disaster is to be given, autonomy, given the ability to operate themselves, not rely on government to do the handouts of water or petrol or shelter and things like that. People want to lean forward. I think the same thing applies in this environment, where if you can give people the knowledge and the insight, then they can actually respond effectively to it. And it's different, but it's similar. It's a similar mindset of inform people, keep them informed, and keep them informed, and keep them informed, and then they'll come along the journey with you.
Did you find when you were heading the authority that as a leader it was a unique project in terms of the level of agency you had? So you were talking about the different levels of government being aligned and having that consensus. Did it free you up to just make very clear and plain recommendations about what was needed.
Yeah, the Premier, Anna Bligh at the time, she basically got rid of all of her portfolios and just took on reconstruction. So I had a direct line of sight to her. There was a steering group that was set up which involved a representative from the federal government. So Joe Ludwig was the lead and the representative in that. And so what it meant is you had a pretty short line of communication to be able to get feed through and get decisions made. That's a unique circumstance. And I'd have to say, I mean, for 6 months it was seamless, and the answer to every question was always yes. I need someone with this experience. I need this resource. I need that. And the answer was always yes. There was still a real desire to see the state recover, and there was still a real desire to give us the resources that we needed to get it done. And it was extremely rewarding in that regard, where people were just actively wanting to try and fix problems. They weren't putting sticks in the spokes, so to speak.
I might take us back to Cross River Rail, because we've briefly spoken about the project and what it does for SEQ, but it does have an interesting history as a project. There have been a number of iterations over time. Maybe you could just talk us through the evolution of the ideas and where we are today, and what specifically the project that you're delivering, what problem does it solve?
Yeah. So look, Cross River Rail, I think from my research, it sort of goes back around about 2007. I think it was talked about in some kind of form. In 2010, actually, when I was the Coordinator General and Director General of the Infrastructure Department, we actually recommended it up as Queensland's #1 infrastructure project. So sort of as far back as that. At that stage, it was a longer tunnel. It was almost twice the length that it is now. And it had a slightly different configuration, but largely the alignment through the city was the same. In 2012, when there was a change of government, the Newman government suggested an alternative project, which they called the BAT tunnel, which basically was a bus and train tunnel. It took a different alignment along George Street, but its southern portal was similar to ours now, a bit further south, but it was similar. But then when the Palaszczuk government was re-elected, they moved more back to the original alignment. So to come to your question about what's the problem that it's solving, it really is that choke point in the CBD. All the trains in Brisbane have to go through Roma Street Central and the Valley, but more so the ones coming from the south have to go across the Merivale Bridge, and that's the only crossing there. It has a capacity of 24 trains per hour, and the forecast started saying, well, in the near future, that's going to be reaching capacity. Now, obviously, COVID has had a bit of an influence on that, but the reality is if you want to have that frequent service, you're going to run out of capacity pretty quickly. So not only does the current alignment not put you in the middle of the CBD and drop people off where they want to get off, but also you've got a capacity constraint in the core. So by putting Cross River Rail through, it's essentially a 6 kilometre tunnel that goes in just south of the city around the Dutton Park area near the PA Hospital. It goes below ground past the Woolloongabba cricket ground and puts a railway station at the Gabba, which anybody who's ever tried to get to the Gabba for any event would know that that's desperately needed. It's a horrible place to get to with public transport. It's just really difficult. It goes under the river and then has a station at Albert Street, and then has a station at Roma Street, which is really going to become the biggest interchange of all forms of transport. So all buses, the proposed Brisbane Metro goes through there, interstate coaches go through there, interstate rail and rural rail for Brisbane go through there, and all the suburban rail go through Roma Street. So it'll become really, we refer to it as the Grand Central Station, where basically if you want to do an interchange, that's the place to go. Airport rail goes through there as well. And then we're also doing station upgrades on the southern corridor, where we've got a lot of the older inner core stations, which were built, some of them back in the late 1800s, have still got the timber stairs. There's no lifts, so they're not DDA compliant. So we're basically upgrading 6 of those stations to get that compliance. And then on top of that, we're building 3 new railway stations at the Gold Coast. So there's plenty to do. And I haven't even mentioned the signalling. So,
I don't want to pick. There was a mistake in what you said, Graeme. I don't want to dwell on it too much.
that?
But you referred to the Gabba as a cricket ground, and following this week's announcement, it will be a multi-purpose Olympic-ready stadium, not just a cricket ground. I think you've underplayed what the Gabba is.
I don't want to preempt the IOC decision.
I said Olympic ready, not Olympic. Olympic ready.
Olympic ready. Yeah. No, look, absolutely. That's I think, and that's the big push. I think is with the new thinking from the IOC is around how do we use existing infrastructure? How do you use the Olympics as a way to really allow cities to reinvigorate? I mean, the notion, and Sydney's been through this, the notion of spending money on a stadium is a bit of a fraught issue, and the Gabba has needed an upgrade for a while. It's a great facility. I love the Gabba, but it's been incrementally upgraded over time, and it's probably time it needed one big facelift, and this Olympics gives a massive excuse to do that big facelift and get the whole thing back to modern day standards. So, great opportunity.
You've traced for us what the project does, but there are some complexities in it. One thinks about the integration of existing rail lines with a new connection that sits in the middle. There's some similarities there with a famous project in London, the Crossrail project, which those listeners that are familiar with it will know that was took a long time in its genesis. The construction delivery was very strong, but the integration with the existing rail line has been fraught with challenges. To what extent are those similarities with Cross River Rail true, and what can you learn from projects like that one to make sure that we avoid that sort of sticky part at the end when it comes to operational readiness?
Yeah, look, we've been sort of watching Crossrail, but we've also been working pretty closely with Sydney and Melbourne Metro and having regular dialogues with those guys, and also our compatriots in Perth as well, but more so Sydney and Melbourne. Melbourne's quite similar to us in the respect that it's an integration or an augmentation of an existing rail network. The rolling stock that will go through Cross River Rail is the same rolling stock that QR is already using, so we're designing it to be an enhancement to the existing network. We are adding a new signalling system, so ETCS Level 2 will be in the tunnel as well.
Okay, so you're going to have to explain for the non-rail nerds what ETCS Level 2 is.
So it's European Train Control System. So effectively it's a digital in-cabin system. So when you're on the train and you see a light on the side of the road, the rail, where the driver will sort of see the different coloured lights to give them indications when to stop and go and slow down. In ETCS, that's actually all in the cabin. So it's been in operation in Europe for quite some time. Not so common here in Australia, and certainly not at all on the Queensland rail network. So this will be the first time that's been implemented, because really in the tunnel you can't have line of sight signalling. So you need to have a digital one in the cabin.
So that still requires a driver responding to those signals. It's not a driverless system like we have on Sydney Metro.
No, it still requires a driver, and definitely does require a driver and guard as well. And so what that'll mean, though, is that rather than the driver looking outside the cabin for the signalling, it's actually on the inside of his cabin, but it's or her cabin. And so it is a lot safer though as well. It means that the signalling going back to the control centre, the train control centre has a better connection to the train. It also means that the train has some automatic shut-off, so the risk of a train passing a signal by, say, driver error or mechanical error is significantly lessened, because the digital system can intervene. It will give a warning and give further warning, and then we'll stop the train. So it means you can actually run the trains a lot closer to each other on the network, which then means you can have high-frequency service. So that's what that's all about, and ultimately that'll be rolled out across the wider South East Queensland network. But Cross River Rail will be the first sector to get that signalling into it. So to come back to your sort of Crossrail question, the the lessons out of there, when I was over in London in 2018, that was when they were starting to get into a bit of strife there. And the one thing they kept talking about was allow enough time for system integration. Don't cut it short. And they crunched their time. The civil works were done well. Everything was done well, and everybody was really happy. But when they got to the system integration, they ran out of time. And well, I've been to Sydney recently, been to Melbourne recently, and had exactly the same message from those guys. And they're all saying, just plan ahead, get ahead. The other one is really getting good, solid integration between your contracts and your contractors, so there's not scope gaps. You're all working off a single aligned program, and everybody's got transparency around that program, and making sure your interfaces are really clear. We're fortunate here that the same contractor is delivering our stations as is delivering the tunnels, whereas in Sydney they've got challenges with greater interface with overstation development. So there's certain benefits we've got, but there's also the same challenges. We're certainly not taking it lightly.
It just strikes me as such a wide range of interface risks on the one project, and you almost have to unbundle it and progress all of those different projects. How much are those sets of risks unique to each project? So when you went and spoke to the project teams in London, or when you've done that in Sydney and in Melbourne, are there templates to follow, or is it really just the learning that you need a lot of time and you need to dedicate a lot of resource to it?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of similarities between them, but each project is different. So, you can take the feed that really at my technical level they're getting is there's some things that are quite specific that they can pick up. The other is at a leadership level where you can set the right tone across contracts and across programs and project directors and get that alignment. I mean, at the end of the day, contractors are wanting to make money, governments are wanting to have projects delivered. No one benefits if there's disputes. And so if there's some thinking you can do, the one thing you can't get back is time. So the sooner we think about it, the sooner we communicate about it, and we set up our systems to have that dialogue. But there are a lot of similarities between the projects, but each has its own unique thing. But we've certainly learned a lot, and really most appreciative of our colleagues in Melbourne and Sydney. They've been very generous.
Graeme, you spoke about time and the thing you can't get back. Now, I'm a keen follower of your TBM tracker. TBM Elsie's currently under, I guess, just past Kangaroo Point, just past River Terrace there. How far? 720 metres travelled. Merle 235 metres, and Roadheader 1 and 2 less imaginatively named, I might say, the road headers.
We tried to work out whether you could name a road header, but I don't think people went for that one.
It's not quite got the same appeal, I guess. But just on the timing question, is that like how fast do you expect your TBMs to go? Are they ahead of schedule? How does that work? I mean, it's great that we can have a look at them here, but how does that track against schedule?
Yeah, we were fortunate. I mean, the teams worked really well, and we got the TBMs in, both of them actually in, slightly ahead of program, and they're going quite well. I mean, TBMs are complex beasts. They tend to do, on average, 20 metres a day. On average. I mean, I was down there the other day, and one of them had done 40 metres in a day, so they were pretty happy with that progress. In Brisbane, it's all rock down there, so we don't have the sort of variability of subsoil and so forth. I mean, I saw what they have in Perth, that the challenges they've got over there, but even in Sydney around the harbour, we've got rock and more rock, and some of it's hard, and some of it's really hard, and some of it's really, really hard. The fortunate thing we've got is there's been a couple of road tunnels built nearby and similar to our alignment, and then of course the footings under all the CBD towers are all founded on rock as well. So there's pretty good knowledge around the geotech. Probably the biggest challenge at the moment is the rock is really hard, and it's the bit that the road headers are biting up against in the caverns, and they've got their work cut out for them. But the TBMs can come right through and interface with the caverns and just keep going. So we're quite comfortable that they're heading in the right direction.
So can you tell us what the inspiration for the names was?
Yeah, so
I'm quite fond of those names, Elsa and Merle.
So Merle and Elsie. So Elsie Shepherd and Merle Thornton. So Elsie Shepherd was one of Queensland's first female engineers. She's a electrical engineer, and she graduated from UQ. All the details are on our website, but wonderful woman. I've met her. She's come and spoken with our staff, and is a real inspiration. And then Merle Thornton was the woman who chained herself to the Regatta Hotel public bar, when women weren't allowed to drink beer in the public bar, and basically got the laws changed so that women could go to public bars. So there you go. So both really inspirational women. I've spoken with both of them. They're really lovely people, and very proud and humbled to be part of the project. And great, a couple of, we call them groundbreaking Queenslanders, ironically.
That's amazing.
That's great. And it goes to a broader question. Janice and I have done work together in the past on social license in projects. How have you built the social license? And talk us through the continuing nature of that need for social license for projects.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question in the regard to, you don't start off with it. And in fact, when we started this project, we were in a real deficit, because there was a lot of perception. The project had been talked about for quite some time. Nobody actually believed the project was going to happen. Even when the government committed, there was the political noise around it at the front end, which you're well aware of, Adrian, in relation to the funding from the federal government, and then the Queensland government going it alone. And that created a degree of sort of cynicism and scepticism around whether the project was going to happen. So, I mean, in my first year in this job, people were sort of going, yeah, but it's never going to happen. I had to get out and go and spend a lot of time talking to the construction sector to really fill people in on the intent and the government's intent, and that we were deadly serious, that we were going to get on with it. Really just getting on with it, and then just persisting with the message, being realistic. You can't overpromise and underdeliver. You need to be really clear about what your message is and how you're going to do it. Give people an understanding of what the level of disruption is going to be, but what the end game is looking like. What was interesting is early on we discovered that people weren't really interested in talking about the precinct benefits, because if you don't believe the tunnel and railway station's ever going to happen, how can you be convinced that there's going to be precinct benefits? So we dropped that as a messaging early on until we really got into the construction phase, and then people suddenly turned their mind to saying, hang on a minute, there will be a station here, what does that mean? And that starts to enable the thinking for those next stages. So we've been chipping away for some time. We've evolved the message. Early on, the messaging has been very much about the sort of turn up and go, more jobs, those sorts of things. The more trains more often, that's often used around the place. We use those messaging. We're now moving towards transforming the way you travel, because it's trying to make it more about that personal journey, as to you go on the train and where you get off is going to be different to where you get off now, or your purpose for travel will change, or if you have never thought about using the train before, you'll think about it now because it's actually a better option. So it's you've got to almost renew the message, but also renew it with people's acceptance of that future. So yeah, it's not something, and you can burn social license pretty quickly. I mean, we're at the moment in the middle of delivery, and part of the TBM tracker is to sort of, you can't see a TBM, so how do people know where it's up to? So we've got a lot of heavy effort on social media to sort of keep the message going out so people are aware of what's going on. And we learn also a lot of from our counterparts interstate and where they're up to. But also just communicating heavily with the people who are in the impacted zones. And we've got, noise and dust is always an issue, vehicles coming and going at night. Sometimes contractors and subcontractors don't do the right things. It's how you respond to those things, preempt them, but how you respond to them that really matters to keep that social license.
And with COVID, have you found any of that commitment has wavered? So what has happened to, say, public transport patronage through the pandemic, and how can you make sure that coming out of the pandemic, the case is as strong for continued public transport use?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, there's two elements to COVID. The front end is obviously the how we got on with the job. And what was interesting is Australia took a position, and Adrian, you were heavily involved in this, as was I and our colleagues, took a position that construction and infrastructure was an essential service. And I'm really pleased with us as an industry, but also governments latching onto that and realising there was something that was important, keep people employed, keep these projects moving. They didn't do that in every other country. So
Graeme, I don't know that people realise how touch and go it was at one point, and ourselves alongside you and a lot of other people around the country in constant communication to reassure our political leaders that you could continue to construct the biggest infrastructure investment in a generation and not pull the pin on it in a safe way with additional controls, but not stop. And there was probably a 36-hour period in the middle of that. I know it's back in late March 2020 when it was touch and go for a while.
It was a bit nervous, and when we were seeing it shut down in other countries, it didn't put it beyond the realm. But the contractual risk that sort of came with that, but also the loss of jobs. There was just massive. So the ability to sort of keep the momentum going. The line I argued pretty heavily is it's actually going onto a construction site is more controlled than going into a hospital. You can't go onto a construction site without the right tickets, without the right guidance, and without the right gear. And then on a construction site, you can up the ante on protection, face masks, keeping people to particular zones, timing of arrival, timing of departure, who touches what, all those sorts of things are a lot more control on a construction site, usually under the guise of safety, but in a health safety environment too. It just all worked out well. So I think that was an important aspect of it. In relation to the patronage, I think there's a lot of close monitoring there at the moment. We are seeing the sort of rebound in public transport use at the moment. I think we'll see changes in patterns of work. I think what we'll see is broader shoulders of peak rather than the sharp peaks that we've seen in the past.
Graeme Newton, the historian, earlier in this conversation told us you traced back the history of Cross River Rail to about 2007, about 14 years ago. And you're well underway now. So we'll discount it. We'll say about 12 years between conception and beginning. If we cast forward 12 years from now, as we are in April 2021, we should have just had an Olympics, hopefully a successful awarded and executed Olympics in Brisbane. Given the 12 to 14 year genesis of Cross River Rail, it strikes me that we probably need to be thinking about some of the infrastructure decisions to support the Olympics should Brisbane be successful pretty soon. I wonder if you could just talk us through your experience with that idea of taking a project from conception to reality, just how long that takes and the challenges with with getting things off a sort of an idea to an execution, and just I guess just reinforce that need to start thinking about those decisions today.
It's the experience really is one where if there's an actual target or an objective that you need to achieve. So whether it's a constraint in the network that's modelled, or whether it's an Olympics that are coming around the corner, or whether it's a reconstruction to get the state's economy back up and going, and you've got a 3-year window to get it up. It's giving a sort of a time horizon which is achievable, realistic, but also has relevance that people can buy into. So the Olympics, having an Olympic Games, and you've got to get your house in order. And if you're having a party on the weekend in 3 weeks' time, you sort of will mow the lawn and clean up the bathroom and get everything sorted. Well, in our case, we're going to have a big party in 12 years' time, so we've got to get things sorted out. So sorting out the transport network, getting good systems where they work, where Brisbane Metro, Cross River Rail, the other Queensland Rail assets, roads, arterials, getting those things squared away are just the sort of fundamentals that we need to do. Then you've got the venues to get sorted out. Obviously, there's the Gabba that's being talked about. Brisbane Live at Roma Street is one that's being talked about as well as an indoor entertainment arena. But from what we're looking at around our stations, we've got quite large potential property developments where you can create, good public realm, beautiful spaces for people to recreate at, but also bring town centres in. So things like Wollongabba, create a whole new town centre there, which adds energy to that place. Roma Street's got a lot of development there. I mean, we've demolished the transit centre, which will just change the whole face of Roma Street. And we've forecast in our precinct, strategy that there's sort of 12 to 15 years worth of development in each one of those sites. So that will go well beyond the Olympics. And it really sort of sets, it's getting the house in order for the Olympics with venues and the public realm, and then carrying that through in the post-Olympics legacy environment, which is going to be important. I mean, don't forget there's projects like Queen's Wharf are going to be coming online in the meantime, and other projects like the second runway have already been delivered, and Howard Smith Wharf. So there's a bunch of projects that have happened or are in the process of happening, and all of that is part of getting the house in order. And you would hope that the big party of the Olympics really galvanises everyone to work effectively together.
Yeah, I like that idea of something being necessity driven, but there's also an opportunity with the Olympics. I think about 2025 as when your project opens, 2032, and the couple of preceding years around the Olympics, and then the longer term over those horizons. There's an opportunity actually to bring forward some of the benefits of the infrastructure that could be delivered to support the Olympics into the sort of, I don't know, sort of 5 to 8 year window from now, rather than the sort of decade to 12 years. Brisbane Live is an example of that. Probably an attachment to your project that maybe hasn't had the airtime that some of the other components have. Perhaps you could just talk us through Brisbane Live, location, setup, what is envisaged there as it currently stands.
Yeah, so Brisbane Live, it's basically an indoor entertainment arena. So it's like Kudos Bank Arena or the Perth Arena. So it's about an 18,000 seat arena, which would host concerts, basketball, e-games, those sorts of multi-purpose type venue. The sort of concerts that would normally be held out of the Boondall Entertainment Centre, but really what we're seeing with these types of facilities is they're tending to be more located closer to the CBD to make it part of the entertainment offering that cities offer. It's located directly adjacent to the Roma Street station. The idea is it would be built over the rail line, so not dissimilar to, say, Federation Square in Melbourne. So there's a lot of challenges with that, though, when you start trying to build over rail. So it does make it an expensive proposition to conceive and to build. So therefore, it'll require some pretty innovative engineering to drive the costs down. And I guess that's always been the challenge with Brisbane Live. Everybody loves it, but it's an expensive option. So if you've got an Olympics coming along and you've got some interest from private sector investment and you've got the ability to think laterally around your engineering design, we would hope you'd be able to drive the costs down, but also give that impetus to move on.
I'm going to ask a deliberately provocative question, if I may. There has been a perception over time from some parts of Australia that Brisbane's always been a one project town. And it is true now that there is one big dominant project in Brisbane, when in some other jurisdictions there's sort of 2 or 3 big things happening at any one time. Well, firstly, is that true? And secondly, if to some extent it's true, to what extent has it driven sort of sequencing of projects, capacity to attract talent, brain drain versus attracting people back, and what's the impact of that?
Yeah, look, I think there's possibly a bit of a perception about the nature of it, but what I would point out, there's about $30 billion worth of projects actually going on in Brisbane at the moment. There's quite large private sector project in the project being done, Queen's Wharf by Star, and that's 6 hotels are being built at once. It's quite an amazing project that's happening right in the core of the CBD. Obviously, Brisbane Metro, which is the council's core, public transport project, which is we'll see, new sort of bus type rolling stock come in, plus enhancements to stations and things like that will be part of that as well. The airport has just been finished out of Brisbane, and it was a pretty major investment. And then we've seen other private sector investments. And you've got Hurston Quarter happening, which is a research-based facility out at the Royal Queensland Hospital. So there's a lot of sort of projects that are sort of humming away under the radar to some extent because they're not big grey infrastructure projects, but by in their own sector they're actually quite large and quite significant projects. Sydney and Melbourne are doing a lot of rail and road tunnel type work. We're doing less so of that because we are not sort of at that sort of capacity constraint, if you like, and that's why I guess Cross River Rail may well have that greater perception in this sector. But I'd have to say across other sectors we're actually seeing quite a lot of work happening.
So you've teed it up beautifully for my actual question, and I was deliberately provocative in that one, which is there is a lot going on. There's a lot going on the broader East Coast. From an infrastructure and private sector, private project, real estate, commercial development perspective. What's that doing to skills, resources, the contracting sector, and how are you seeing that manifest in the work you're doing?
It's been an interesting one, because what we actually found is a lot of people who were gaining or had gained a lot of infrastructure experience interstate were really keen to move to come back to Brisbane. So a lot of Queenslanders who were doing almost like the FIFO but into those capital cities jumped at the opportunity to come back. So it's presented that opportunity which the boomerang workers who have got these sort of global experiences who just want to come back and live in their own hometown. That said, though, there are some other areas where there's some real challenges, and right across the eastern seaboard, things like people with signalling capability, people with system integration capability, they're really challenging to find, and everybody wants them at the same time. But it's been a sort of a bit of a mixed bag, but it's certainly one where we haven't necessarily struggled. It's probably more people are picking and choosing where they would like to be, and we're fortunate there's a lot of Queenslanders with a lot of experience who want to actually come back and work in their own hometown. And the opportunity to work on a project like this that has significance in their own hometown, but also that it's not in some far-flung mining community or something like that, is really appealing for them as well.
Has the closure of international borders and the difficulty of getting people in, has that had an impact, or are we discovering we can do a lot more stuff remotely?
Yeah, look, it's probably a combination of both, but we have found that if we're wanting to pick up people with specific technical experiences, so the signalling, the ETCS experience, because that hasn't had a lot of exposure in Australia before, you are actually reliant on either Australians who have worked overseas or overseas people who have knowledge and they want to come and work here. That does have an impact on their ability to get into the country. What's been interesting is some of those people who have worked, been global citizens, they've worked all over the place. COVID's made it challenging for them to get their security clearances, where they might have worked in a Middle Eastern country for some time, and they've got to get information from that country's embassy or something like that, and it's just not as accessible in a COVID environment. So it's a sort of an interesting challenge that we've had. We had one guy worked remotely for many months by the time he got his work visa security clearances, just simply because of the logistics involved.
It sounds as though there were both, challenges but also benefits during the COVID pandemic then. So did you find that there were aspects of the project that were almost working at higher levels of productivity, that had less interference from other users on the network and whatnot?
So we've had both sort of, technical and operational sort of opportunities that have come out of COVID. The operational sort of side of things, for example, when the border closed and the XPT train got kept on the New South Wales side of the border, it meant that we could actually get in to do the demolition more efficiently at Roma Street, because we didn't have to relocate temporarily the XPT platform. So that just saved us a whole bunch of work. there were other opportunities that sort of came through where you're creating less disruption on the roads, or when you're got your haul vehicles coming and going in the CBD. When the CBD shut down, it kind of made life a little bit easier, and we were able to get some more flexible working hours during the COVID lockdown period, particularly last year. It has created some challenges in relation to the technical skill. But what was interesting is the design teams gave feedback that they were more efficient in their productivity because they were able to concentrate on the task at hand. But generally, I'd say in a majority of cases in a project world, you kind of need that personal interaction, because that's when the magic happens, and that's when it's those sort of sidebar conversations, or someone wandering up to someone else in the workplace and just having a bit of a quiet chat with them about something, or these projects are so built on relationships and trust that COVID did sort of create a bit of a barrier to that when we were in lockdown. And I think our return to work rate has been actually very high, because people are much prefer that sort of interaction and that engagement with each other.
On the skills piece, so if I think over the last 10 years, there's been a consistent conversation about skills shortages. Not so much shortages of labour, but specific highly skilled people in particular areas. We're 10 years into, I think, what most people think is a 30-year cycle of major infrastructure investment. I personally think it's deeply frustrating that 10 years into that, we're still talking about needing people with 10 years of experience, because we probably haven't capitalised on the opportunity. How do we not have the same conversation in 10 years' time, that we still need people with 10 years' experience?
I think that there's a sort of, the answer is kind of yes and no in relation to skill shortages. We've never seen more people interested in STEM and engineering type of studies. We've never seen more opportunities for those people as well. What I'm excited about is the fact that rail in Australia, for the first time in a very long time, has had this resurgence of knowledge and capability and enthusiasm to be part of it. Young engineers will graduate and want to get into rail, because rail is probably second only to aviation as far as technology goes, and the stuff that we're seeing in the signalling is just, it's next level, because it's all safety based. So I think it'll start becoming a more attractive career, as opposed to seeing the demographic of people working in rail sort of heading towards the 50s and 60s by average. Whereas I think we'll see the younger engineers will really want to get involved in rail tunnelling. It's got everything: tunnels, technology, design. It's got all sorts of things that, why wouldn't you want to be involved in it? And I think we'll see. So as far as skill shortage goes, it's a matter of how we grab those new entrants and get their enthusiasm, but get them up to speed.
Graeme, we've asked all of our guests on Inside Infrastructure the same question, and season 2 is no different. And the question is, what's your favourite type of infrastructure and why?
My favourite type of infrastructure? Oh God, it's hard. I'd have to say I do love a good tunnel. It's I've been in tunnels all around the world. I've been on TBMs all around the world, and there's just something special about being 50 metres below ground, watching this machine beavering away, and then when you walk out, you've got this perfectly circular tunnel that you walk out of out the back end. There's something sort of special about that.
So it's is it tunnels under construction, or is it like just tunnels when they're made?
Tunnels under construction. It just feels it's progress in progress. It sort of shows you can feel the change that it's creating. For millions of years that rock has lain undisturbed, and all of a sudden it's now going to have activity and people moving through it. So that's the inspiration for me.
That was probably one of the most profound answers we've had. It was quite deep and moving.
I quite like that. I have a question. Can I throw a question in? This is a bit of a tabloid question. But, but somebody in our Brisbane office recalled seeing a picture back in 2011 of you next to the Premier and Prince Philip and the Queen. Did you get to meet Prince Philip? What was he like? How was that?
So so the circumstance was when the Queen and Prince Philip came to visit Brisbane after the floods in 2011, and the Premier and I sort of were involved, and they were on a boat, quite a large boat, going down the Brisbane River. And I had a short period in which I stood on the deck with the Queen and Prince Philip, and I explained, the impact of the flood in Brisbane CBD. And as we sort of went along, everybody was on the side of the riverbank waving at us, and it took a lot of willpower not to wave back. I knew that you have this feeling they're waving at you, but actually they're not waving at you. But they were actually really engaged and very very interested. But I'd have to say it was one of the most surreal experiences on a boat cruising down the Brisbane River with crowds waving at you. It was a surreal experience, but it was I felt very honoured to be asked to be part of that, and to meet the Queen and Prince Philip was in our own hometown was wonderful.
I wish I'd seen the Newton version of the Royal Wave.
I looked for the photo and I couldn't find it.
You have it? I could send it to this.
Have you got it? I do, please.
Graeme Newton, it's been a hugely enjoyable discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and thank you for being on Inside Infrastructure.
Great, thanks very much. Great to be part of it.
Thanks very much.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks as always to PwC Australia for their continued collaboration on Inside Infrastructure. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast platform and leave us a rating or comment on LinkedIn. If you have any suggestions, then please feel free to send us those, either to Janice or myself. We've certainly appreciated the messages we've been receiving so far. This episode was recorded and edited by Adam Stevens from TAG, PwC Australia's internal media agency. Research was conducted by Linda Bierschen, Brendan Pearce and Michael Player.